So please join me in welcoming Secretary Buttigieg and Professor Raj Kumar to the stage for our discussion.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to have Secretary Buttigieg here visiting CMU and Pittsburgh. Thanks for joining us. So, Secretary Buttigieg, would you like to say a few words?
Great. Yeah, thank you, first of all, for joining. Thank you to our hosts here at Carnegie Mellon. I've really been looking forward to being able to do this. Let me just take 3 or 4 minutes to explain why, and then we'll jump right into the discussion, because mainly I want to be here to soak up some insights and wisdom from all of you. We realized I'd have a chance to come here because we're making an announcement this week about bringing $142 million to fix I-376. Really excited. It's exactly the kind of thing we were working to so hard on President Biden's infrastructure package to make possible. I think I'm going to get a taste of the notorious bathtub later today, part of what we're going to be dealing with there. And when we saw that there was going to be a good reason to come to Pittsburgh, and we were looking at the calendar and figuring out what else I could do in town and still get home in time to pick up the kids, which it's my turn to do today at daycare, the first thing that came to mind was I really want to get over to Carnegie Mellon, and I'll tell you why. First of all, this institution is hosting the lead of the consortium that is doing critically important safety research work. And that is something that I hope we'll be able to explore right now because it's the main reason my department exists, and we believe your insights will help us to save lives. But it's also more broadly that I think this is a place that really gets the relationship between cool, interesting ideas and technologies and the why of it all. This is a place, as I tried to style my own hometown of South Bend as when I was mayor and I was often in touch with my counterpart, Bill Peduto, who's here, who's now joined your ranks, about how to do this right, is to be a place where talent meets purpose. Because the truth is the reason why transportation technologies, any technologies matter isn't that they're cool, although most of us, I think, are nerds who just think they're intrinsically cool. But it's the why of it and how they make us safer or how they help address issues like equity and climate and some of the other searing issues of our time. And I know that you're very dialed in on that, and I want to get smarter and better at it here, just as I got smarter and better at how to be a mayor, based partly on the work that was going on at Metro 21 and other efforts right here at CMU back when I wore that hat. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm really excited to be with you. Thanks again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. Let's start with something basic. Tell us about the accomplishments of the department that you are the most proud of.
All right. Oh, that's a great way to begin. Okay. What I'm proudest of, and I say this with the humility of knowing that we've got a lot of unfinished business and a lot of work to do, but what I'm proudest of is I think we can already say that each form of transportation is better than we found it. I can say that about aviation for all of the challenges that we face, including what's going on right now with FAA's work to ensure there's the right kind of quality coming out of Boeing. But we can already say that there have been major improvements in aviation. If you just think about when we got here, the big problem with airlines was, are they going to go out of business? And that was only 3 years ago. We got through that. And then a year and a half later, the economy had come back so quickly under President Biden that the big problem with our airlines was, how come they can't get people to where they're going on time with all the demand that's coming in? So we cracked down on airlines and really pushed them to improve their service. And they have. Last Thanksgiving, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, was the busiest day for passengers getting on airplanes in American history. And the cancellation rate was less than a fraction of a percent. So we've gotten some major improvements there. Passengers have more rights. If you're getting on a plane anytime soon, go to flightrights.gov. You can see more about what you can expect and demand from your airline. And we're moving the ball there. I could say the same thing about railroads and railroad safety and railroad workers. 2 years ago, 0% of railroad workers could be certain that they had access to paid sick leave. Today we're at 87% of union railroad workers, and we're hoping to get that to 100. I'm also mindful that we're just a few miles from where that Norfolk Southern East Palestine crash happened. It was almost a year ago. Since then, we have inspected thousands of miles of track. Just yesterday, we were able to finalize a rule on emergency breathing apparatus for crews on those trains. We've advanced a rule having to do with the minimum size of crews on trains. Now, again, there's unfinished business, especially in Congress, and I really hope that Congress is prepared to act before we get to the 1-year mark and finally pass this Railway Safety Act, a bipartisan legislation, by the way, one of whose sponsors is Representative DeLuzio from right here in this area. But we're not waiting on Congress to do what we can do. So that's something else that's better than we found it. Roadway safety, I say this advisedly and with humility, because there's such a long way to go. But one of the biggest things we set out to do is reduce the rise in roadway deaths. And we believe, reverse the rise and set ourselves on a path towards zero. We are seeing indications on the strength of the last few quarters worth of data that horrifying peak of about 40,000 deaths a year, that we're coming off of that. A lot of work to do to accelerate that, but I'm very encouraged that that has shifted. And then, of course, the thing that gets the most headlines is the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we're so used to it being the law of the land that it's so much so that even people who voted against it seem very quick to come celebrate projects that it's funding. Easy to forget that it was very hard to get that done, that it took a lot of pushing. It was declared dead over and over and over again in 2021 until we finally got to the day when President Biden signed it. And that was a good day. But I knew on that day that our work was just beginning. And I'm proud now of the projects that we funded, mindful of everything we got to do to actually get them done. So I'm thrilled with what we've been able to do with 3 years, but we know the daunting scope of the work ahead.
Thank you. The Secretary Buttigieg really wants to have an interaction with the students in the audience. So let me start off with a student, Wesley Mon, who's the Equity and Diversity in Transportation Fellow on campus. Wesley, tell us a little bit about what you work on, and I believe you have a question for the Secretary.
Yeah, I assist with the biweekly Smart Safety Connection series, which just gives a space to share recent research and technology in the transportation space. And I'm assisting with community engagement on an NSF-funded project deploying fiber optic hazard sensing for geologic hazards in Pittsburgh. But my question is, as the first openly gay cabinet secretary, how has your identity shaped your professional journey, and what advice do you have for aspiring public policy professionals in the LGBTQ+ community?
Well, thanks for the question. I'm very mindful of what it means to have that distinction, and it bears mention that not only did I join the military not that long ago, I mean about 15 years ago, at a time when it was the policy of my country to fire me for who I was if that were to come out. But it actually hasn't been that long since you couldn't work in the federal government at all, like as a geographer, let alone a soldier, let alone a cabinet secretary, if it was known that you were gay. In the 50s, tons of good, talented public servants were pushed out in an episode that is not as well known as the Red Scare of McCarthyism, but is known as the Lavender Scare, and whose history is coming to be better known. So I'm mindful of all the people who didn't get to serve or didn't get to have their talents applied to public service just because of who they are. And I try to square that very kind of weighty, historic set of issues with the fact that to me, it's a very everyday thing of just the simple fact that I'm in a marriage, happens to be to a guy who's a wonderful husband, who is very much expecting me to be home in time to pick up the kids today. And it's so, in some ways, probably the least unusual. The closest thing to normal in my life is my marriage. It just happens to be to a dude. And so I try to balance those two things. And I try to bear that in mind as I look at all of the other patterns of exclusion. Even if I don't have any lived experience, I don't have any lived experience that would give me any personal insight on what it's like to be driving while black. I don't have any personal experience of what it's like to negotiate our aviation system or our subway systems as a wheelchair user. I don't have any personal experience with what it's like to wonder if well, I have a little bit, but not like most environmental justice communities, how transportation, would affect the air quality in my neighborhood, right? not the way that kids with asthma in the area of some of our biggest ports are dealing with it, overwhelmingly black and brown kids, right? And so I know that all of these, seemingly vanilla kind of nuts and bolts questions we deal with in transportation actually have a lot of moral weight to them that has to do with inclusion, which is why I applaud the work you're doing on community engagement, because we hear about community engagement like it's some kind of frill sometimes, this extra ornamental thing on top of the real work, which is to get out there and turn a spade and build the thing. But how you build the thing really matters. Who it helps, who it hurts. Getting that right is everything, because people's lives, not just their transportation lives, but their whole lives, go better or go worse, depending on whether their voices were heard. And we know we got to get it better than we got it in the 50s and 60s. I'm shocked by how controversial it was when I made reference to the simple fact that a lot of black neighborhoods got wiped out by the way highways were built. And I didn't bring that up because I want everybody to feel bad about it. I brought it up because we can do something about it, because we have funding to do something about it with. I mean, the Hill District right here in Pittsburgh is one of thousands of examples around the country. And we can do something about that. So that's I guess, how it all adds up for me. And I appreciate the question.
Thank you, Wesley. Let's go to this side of the room. Students take precedence. You can raise your hand if you have a question. Yeah, let's take the microphone there.
My name is Carrie Gandy. I study the social equity of bridge maintenance in the United States. I'm wondering, as you promote equity throughout the department or any of your other strategic objectives, has that caused a culture change or paradigm shift or required one? And how have you led such a large organization through something like that? Thanks.
Thanks for your work. Can I get a little bit more of a gloss on your work? I'm just interested to know what it means to examine equity in bridge maintenance.
Looking at the communities next to bridges and comparing that with their condition, we actually found that bridges in majority Black or African American communities and disadvantaged communities, the disadvantaged community indicator that's used for Justice 40 initiative, those were more associated with being in poor condition throughout the country.
There you go. Okay. So, yeah, I think it has required a cultural push, mainly in order to make sure that these things are regarded as just basic to the importance of the work that we do. And it's why I know the term equity has become very politically and socially loaded. To me, it's a synonym for fairness. And it has always been a legal requirement, though not always one we lived up to, that there be fairness in the work that we do. It's why we take Title VI, for example, very seriously, civil rights law as it applies to our department. And I have legal responsibility to make sure that Title VI is enforced. And so part of what I'm trying to do is make sure that this is not just the project of a secretary or a presidential administration, but that it's actually just part of how the department does business. Because I think success looks like this not being some special initiative, but just something that, of course, you would take into account the fairness of how these dollars are being distributed. Of course, you would want to make sure that there's no systematic reason why, if you're statistically likely to be an overburdened and underserved community based on racial makeup or economic history or anything else, that would compound and make you even worse off. We should do something about that. And so taking those things into account is part of what fairness looks like. And that's true whether it's in terms of what gets built and where. So are we building things in a way that benefits the places that could stand to benefit from them the most? Is transit going to transit deserts? Are bridges being improved in poor neighborhoods just as much as they are in and around wealthy neighborhoods? Those kinds of questions. By the way, also, this isn't just a racial matter. It's also the rural-urban divide, right? Which is another equity area that doesn't code the same way politically, but we take it seriously in the same way as a department. But then the other thing is all the opportunity we're creating. We are in the middle of moving $1 trillion through the American economy. That's a lot of work. Those are a lot of jobs. And if you pay attention to making it easier for the people who didn't get a shot at that before to get that, and I'll give you another example right from Pittsburgh, which is the airport. There was somebody paid enough attention to the importance of childcare as a barrier to being able to work on these jobs. They set up childcare at the construction site of that new terminal, which means working parents, including a lot of working women who are poised to be excellent workers, but haven't had the chance to do it because of the child care thing. It solved that for them, brought them into the workforce, which is also important for helping the project get done on time. So a win-win-win. But partly possible because attention has been paid to that. I know the governor put out an executive order here in Pennsylvania that requires attention to things like that. And it turns out that's a legal and eligible use of our dollars often, is to solve some of those workforce issues. So I guess that's what it means for us to have that become part of the practice of what we do, and not just some special initiative that's stapled to this or that special month in our department's calendar. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go back to a student working with Safety 21, our National University Transportation Center on Safety, sponsored by the US DOT. Let's go to Lindsay Graff. So Lindsay is a PhD student in civil engineering at Carnegie Mellon. Lindsay, say a few words about what you do and pose your question, please.
Sure. Hi, my name is Lindsay Graff. My research focuses on the design and coordination of urban multimodal networks. Prior to my PhD, I worked for Delta Airlines in the revenue management department. So my question actually pertains to aviation safety, which is something that you mentioned a few minutes ago. So it was recently claimed by a US senator that the FAA's oversight procedures are insufficient in ensuring that Boeing's planes are up to standard. So I was wondering what steps are being taken by the FAA to maintain a proper regulatory environment despite intense lobbying pressure by Boeing and other companies.
Yeah, the FAA comes under a lot of pressure, and I think our administrators are doing a great job there of making sure that the only thing that drives decisions is safety. But this is an enormous undertaking, and it's got a lot of history, as you know. I do think it's important to start by reflecting on the safety record that's been built. It is an astonishing thing that the safest way to travel, the safest way to get around by far, is one that involves being propelled through the sky by flammable liquids at nearly the speed of sound, thousands of feet above the ground, right? Like, that's kind of a wild thing. Like, the safety, the statistical safety, like, technically, you are safer if you are watching this event be live streamed from a seat on board a commercial airliner than you are sitting in this room. But just as importantly, you can't take that for granted. Safety is not some kind of destination. We've had a number of incidents, the Alaska plug door is just one of them, that demonstrate that you can't just say, okay, we figured out how to make planes safe, now they're safe, but rather that you have to continually evolve. And that's not just true in terms of technology, it's true in terms of regulation. There is a spectrum in terms of how the US manages the safety of the different things we regulate. From cars, where we tend not to be on the shop floor, but we publish standards through NHTSA, and if a vehicle doesn't conform to those standards, or if there's a problem or defect, there's a recall. All the way over to the other extreme is probably USDA and the way that we do meat and poultry inspection, where there's literally federal employees on those factory floors. The system that we have, that Congress has created, is somewhere between those two ends of the spectrum, and went through a lot of reform in terms of the regulation of the design after what happened with the 737 MAX crashes of the last decade. But design is part of the picture. Another is assuring that the plane was manufactured in a way that conforms to that design. And that's part of the scope of what Administrator Whitaker has said needs to be fully reviewed. And that's what's going on right now. What does it take to make sure that the manufacturer, which is responsible for conforming to our design standards, actually does? And without prejudging some of what that process is going to determine, I think what's clear, as the administrator said, is it can't be back to business as usual at Boeing. And that has to include attention to every part of the process. It does have to also mean some tough measures. And I think it's without precedent for the FAA to do what it did this week and say, we're capping how many planes you can make. Not going to have you make more than this number until we are completely satisfied that you could grow that number safely. So that's one example of steps that are already underway. But there will be many more to come in the weeks and months ahead. And obviously it's a top focus for, not just for the FAA, but for our entire department.
Thank you, Lindsay. Let's go to this side of the room. Students, any questions? You can raise your hands. I guess in terms of logistics, let's go with the student right by the side of the aisle here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Eric. I'm a second-year MBA student here at the Tucker School of Business at Carnegie. Quick question I had was, I know that you've done a lot with but passenger advocacy and rights through the dashboard. The EU and the UK has 261, which really gets a lot of those advocacies, in legislation. Kind of curious what your thoughts are on whether the US is moving towards that and what kind of regulatory or lobbying hurdles you think that we'll need to address to get to the point where we have kind of enacted legislation on passenger rights and advocacy.
And are you speaking specifically about the European provision on passenger compensation, or are you thinking more about the regulatory framework?
It'll be both.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more on the kind of the compensation side of things, and how we could really push more legislation to ensure advocacy that's fair across all individuals.
Yeah.
As someone who's done a lot of travel before coming to my MBA, I realized that the people who actually are the least aware of some of those rights are the people who are traveling in groups or the elderly. And right now, the access I don't think is as equitable.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of curious, in the bridge between EU 261 and then the technology that universities like CMU could kind of bring together, how we could move forward with that as well.
Yeah, so I think we need to look at two things. First, what are those passenger rights? And then secondly, are passengers able to access their rights? For example, I won't ask for a show of hands, but how many of you knew that if your flight gets canceled, even because of the weather, you have a right to a full refund? Full refund, cash refund. Now, the airline doesn't necessarily say, sorry, your flight got canceled, here's your refund, right? You got to go through steps, and they're like, oh, have some miles, and you got to know not to take the miles, you should take the money if you'd rather have the money, right? So part of the question, I'm glad you mentioned technology, is how to kind of automate that. But it's not automated because the airlines haven't gotten around to it, right? This is a regulatory question. And so part of it is how do we make sure that there is more upfront information so that you don't have to go through hoops in order to get the refund you're entitled to. Another thing we're contemplating right now, and that, by the way, people are empowered and invited to write in on through our notice and comment process of rulemaking, is the idea of there being compensation when you get delayed. In other words, not just, we already made major progress in the last couple of years that the airlines now have to, if you get stuck, and was anybody caught up in the Southwest thing, for example? Yeah, okay, good handful. Did you get your money back? Okay. Okay. But also, that you get your ground transportation, your meals, your hotels, those kinds of things, right? But I'm talking about something different. As you know, in Europe, if it's a really long delay, you get 200 euro, 300 euro, 400 euro, depending on how long the delay was. So we're right now going through the process of a rule that could introduce that here. Southwest actually now does this. If you got delayed or canceled and it was their fault, starting in April, you will get $75 in credit on top of having your expenses covered. Now, they're doing that as punishment because our department made that part of the enforcement action. But it will be interesting to see if other airlines decide to do it to compete with them. Because now that they're doing it, even though it's as punishment, they can take credit or try to compete on that, say it's part of their offering. And I wouldn't be surprised if it actually becomes the norm. So we're pushing on, my point is we're pushing on both of those things. How do we make sure you can access your benefits? And then how do we make sure you get more benefits in the first place? I think our style of doing it will always be different from the EU. But what's interesting about the US regulatory context is you really have two things that happen in parallel. Stuff we can do with our existing legal authority and are doing, and then things Congress could do. So for example, that compensation thing, we're working on it, but it's a long process to get a federal regulation done. Congress could just do it. I'm not necessarily saying they should take that out of our hands, but then again, we wouldn't mind if they enacted that more quickly than we can. Kind of like I'm trying to do on the railway safety front, where yes, we're doing what we can, but Congress should also act. So I think a lot of times a both-and approach is actually appropriate here. And in the meantime, we know that transparency is huge. Of all of the tools we have, and the most powerful would be considered to be enforcement and rulemaking. But actually, the swiftest acting one was transparency. So we came up with this dashboard. This is when we were having that awful summer, everybody was getting canceled. I had a meeting with all of the CEOs to talk about how the flights were getting canceled, and the next day my flight was canceled. And so among other ideas that came up in the department, one of them was, okay, let's just put together a website letting everybody know what they can demand, because if it's in your customer service plan, we can actually go back and enforce it. But nobody knew what was in the customer service plan because it was some PDF, that was impossible to find on the website. So somebody had this bright idea of doing the website with the green checks and the red X's. This is flightrights.gov. And I wrote a letter to the airlines and said, hey, we're going to put all this information up in a couple of weeks. You might want to update your customer service plans before we put that information out there. And they did. It was the most incredible. I've never seen something go that fast on a nationwide basis. So when we do something like that, when we do something like the Airline Passengers with Disabilities Bill of Rights, now again, that's a restatement of the rules that already exist. It's separate from what we're doing to expand those rights. But sometimes just having that information, and I love the point that you made about seniors or people in groups being sometimes maybe disempowered, even though, proportionally they're the ones who had the most at stake. It's one thing to be a frequent flyer who's always traveling. It's another, like, you saved up for years so you could finally go on this big trip, and then something bad happened and you're out some of that money. So you've got me now interested in how we make sure those groups in particular benefit from that information. It's a really good point. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's come back to the front of the audience here. We have Jordan Thompson, who is the Economic Development and Policy Intern at the Regional Industrial Development Corporation of Southwestern Pennsylvania. RIDC, as it is called, is a local nonprofit which owns and manages substantial real estate to basically create economic development zones, create jobs and such. We have a couple of representatives right in the front row here. So Jordan, tell us about what you work on and a question to the secretary.
Okay, so I'm working on the PennStart project, which is like a closed loop research facility that works to advance autonomous vehicle innovation and safety standards. And a lot of my role is just brand research and stakeholder engagement. And my question is, what emerging transportation technologies does the DOT believe have the greatest potential for widespread deployment to improve mobility for communities?
Well, first of all, I look forward to seeing the results of the work that you're doing. It's a fascinating, fast-moving space. And look, two things are true. One, the deployment of some of these automated systems has not come as quickly as we thought. I mean, again, when I was mayor, well, it was about 7 years ago, we set up a committee at the Conference of Mayors to deal with automation. And everybody was telling us in about 7 years, these things would be widely used. And 7 years later, it feels like it's still 7 years away, right? On the other hand, we know that sooner or later this is coming, that it will be profoundly transformative, and that a lot depends on how it's done for passengers and for workers. I would add to that the most important question in all of this is going to be safety. So when you say kind of which things are most interesting or compelling or do we think are going to make a difference, anything that enhances the safety of our roadways has our kind of top tier of attention. Think about it this way. We were talking about aviation safety recently, right? A near miss leads to national news and a lot of work on our department. Meanwhile, the number of people who will get killed today on our roadways is about the same as the number of people who can fit on a 737. And the same thing happened yesterday, and the same thing is going to happen tomorrow. Which means even a 1% reduction in the number of roadway fatalities in this country, that's about 400 people. It's 2 or 3 airplanes worth of people. And the question is, how can these technologies help? How many of you have had the experience of driving with level 2 ADAS? In other words, the cruise control that spaces itself from the car in front of you and nudges you back in the lane. Okay, so this is widespread. Folks here are using it. I won't ask how many of you use it exactly as you're supposed to use it. Hopefully everybody here knows that anything you can buy today, you have to have your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel. I won't ask you whether you always do, but you should. I don't care what they call it. There's some interesting branding out there. Eyes on the road, hands on the wheel.
Yes.
So now there's a whole wave of technology to save you from the technology. Right? When I went to the auto show, they were showing me all the things that the car does. How many of you have had your car tell you you're not paying enough attention? So there's no shame in it, right? Yeah, me too. The little coffee cup comes up, right? It's like, hey, hands on the wheel. That's good. I'm glad the car's telling you that because I'm not in there to whisper it into your ear, right? But it shows you how complicated this journey is, right? In theory, we're getting to a nirvana on the other end where we end the murderous track record of human drivers and save tens of thousands of lives a year. But right at the level we're in, it's like medieval medicine. Like we're just barely making sure the treatment is worse than what it's treating, right? Getting to the next level of that, that's what's exciting to me. And you know, the first areas where it'll be most widespread are a little unclear. Some think that automated driving will be particularly important on our highways because they're kind of fixed route, they're relatively predictable. A lot depends on trucking. We don't have enough truck drivers. By the way, there's still very important work for drivers to do, but they're there as safety drivers. They're getting the paperwork ready, keeping an eye on the machine instead of having to, you know, worry about when they're going to clock out for fatigue and pull over. Others would point to scenarios we don't think about much, like you ever think about what happens when you drop off a rental car before it's back out on the lot? There's a whole sequence of things that go on to clean it, fill it up, and rearrange it. All of which happens at low speed in a closed environment and could probably be done much more efficiently. And it could be a test case where we learn a lot. I'm curious about what you describe as the closed loop that you work on. What I'm talking about here, I guess, is a semi-closed loop. But some of those use cases might emerge long before you and I get in a pod and read the newspaper while it drives us to wherever we're going, right? But that's the bottom line. That's the thing I'm most excited about, is saving lives. As a former mayor, the thing I'm second most excited about, land use. And I see heads nodding, so maybe there's enough planning-oriented people here to know what I'm getting at. Mm-hmm. The amount of our country that is dedicated to surface parking that wouldn't have to be if we had more kind of mobility as a service, which gets easier with some of these automated systems, right? If the car just wakes up, maybe it's out in the county somewhere, and it wakes up and it comes and gets you, instead of having to be in a parking space that has to be paved. And as every mayor knows, that means it has to be plowed, and you have to deal with the water that runs off of it and goes into your stormwater system. Like that adds up massively across the country. And then there's a million other cool things going on, right? But I approach that question of what technologies are most compelling with a lot of humility, because we're actually pretty bad at guessing what's going to matter most. And I'll give you an example of that. Right now we got eVTOLs and flying cars and drones and ADAS, all this stuff, right? The most important transportation technology of the last decade turned out to be the smartphone. It's not even a vehicle. And yet it changed everything from how you board an airplane to how you navigate when you're driving somewhere. So we're not great at always predicting that, but that's why I love hanging out with you all, because you're cooking up the things that will surprise us. And then our job is not necessarily to create those things, although we do fund a lot of the work that you do on that. But our job really is to foster the environment where it does develop safely, where it does develop equitably, where the benefits of that, whether it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions or whether it's saving lives or both, actually come through relatively quickly for the American people.
Could you say a few words about connectivity? There was this battle between the US DOT and the FCC. What do you say about the safety implications of V2X, vehicular communications?
See, this is why I need to be. There's not a lot of places I go where I get the spectrum question. But as you know, it's one of the most important things we were confronted with. And a little bit of history for those who didn't follow the ins and outs of this. About 2 years ago, we were confronted with a bit of an emergency when it became clear that I should mention the previous administration, the telecommunications regulators who authorized the construction of a lot of high-power 5G antennas had not really fully coordinated with the aviation regulators, meaning us, who were concerned about whether that might interfere with radio altimeters, which are very important if you happen to be landing a plane. With the result that at one point it looked like those antennas would go on and huge portions of the US aviation fleet would not be able to fly, at a proportion that would have made anything that we went through in the last 3 years look like nothing. It would have been incredibly disruptive. And thankfully, we were able to set up a dialogue with the companies, and especially Verizon and AT&T, in which they agreed to wait until work and testing could be done to make sure this was completely safely compatible with takeoff and landing. But I think that was a wake-up call for there were some immediate administrative questions we needed to tackle about how the telecom side and the FAA and transportation side talk to each other. But also the technical questions that are emerging now, because that's just the beginning. The spectrum that is going to be needed for vehicles to talk to each other, especially if we go into a high automation future, right? Where right now, because we're used to, in a human-driven car, all the intelligence is on board the car because it's in the human. In an automated environment, not all of the intelligence needs to be in the vehicle. In fact, you could argue more of it should be not on the vehicle than on the vehicle, kind of like with a drone. But for that to happen, the vehicle and the road have to talk to each other. And for that to happen, you need the spectrum. Deconflicting that spectrum is going to be incredibly important. And some of that's a technical problem for you all to work on. Some of it's a public administration problem for us to work on. Like all of a sudden, the NTIA, the FAA, and the FCC, which maybe are not parts of the government that always get up in the morning thinking about each other's problems, need to do a better job of doing that.
Yep. Let's go to a question from Jason Gomes. He studies biotechnology at the Community College of Allegheny County being the county that we are located in. So he's actually, the Community College of Allegheny County is a member of our Safety 21 Transportation Center. Right. Jason, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Jason Gomes. My group is studying the effect of microgravity on cancer cells, and we recently received them back from the ISS. There's some early indications that it actually increases proliferation, but we're still doing analysis on that. So my question is that you're quoted as stating that Pittsburgh will play a key role in advancements like electric vehicles because of its industrialism history. But there are groups that view Pittsburgh as a space hub and the surrounding areas. So what do you see as the contributions that the space industry will make, and how will Pittsburgh play a part?
Yeah, what a great question. Side note, I've gotten to know Mark Kelly pretty well. If you've ever had trouble holding it down at a dinner party, imagine when the person sitting next to you at any given moment can just go straight to astronaut stories and talk about what it's like to land a space shuttle. It's a nice way to break out of the usual Senate topics of conversation. Look, I think space is going to be a huge part of the story, and that's especially true when it comes to commercial space travel. Our department's responsible for licensing that through the FAA. And I think you could say that early on it was a bit like the early internet. Nobody was quite sure what to do with it, and it was a comparatively hands-off approach. Now it happens often enough that we have to worry about questions ranging from what level of safety is appropriate for the passenger side of that, to how do you deconflict the airspace when this stuff has launch windows that could impact commercial flights, to space debris and everything that goes with that. So from the regulatory side, we're contending with an exponential growth in launches. From the macroeconomic side, I think that the opportunity here is enormous. And maybe it's because I'm a child of the industrial Midwest. And so, being from a place that was all about making cars. The South Bend, my hometown, had a trajectory much like Pittsburgh's, except that our bust came 20 years earlier. For us, it wasn't the loss of the steel jobs in the 80s. It was when the Studebaker car company stopped making Studebakers in 1963. But though our bust came sooner, our recovery came later. It took us longer to figure out some of the things you all figured out here. How to turn and face your river, treat it as an asset, not just a conveyor belt. How to use the eds and meds kind of economy to kickstart something. And then I think what this region is still working on, which is how to relate that to the industrial tradition. Because you could argue that the auto tech or steel tech of 100 years ago is kind of equivalent to the space tech of now in terms of what it means and how cutting edge it is and what it means to have an advantage on it. With one important variation, which is I think 100 years ago was much more certain that the US was going to be leading the way. And now it's much more competitive with other countries. And so what I'm building up to is the belief that I don't know exactly what this will mean for Allegheny County or for this region, but I think the job creation potential is colossal. And I think what we have to do is make sure that that these developments are kept safe enough that they don't come to a halt because something very bad happened, without constricting or restraining the innovation that's going to be needed for them to flourish. Because we're not going to figure out, sitting in the DOT headquarters, what the most important applications of some of this space technology are. But we need to create the environment where you all can find them, right? Whether it's the medical applications you happen to be researching or any of the other things that are possible. So yes, bottom line, yes, I'm a big believer in what that means for this part of the country, for my native industrial Midwest, for U.S. competitiveness generally. And when I'm on the Space Council meetings that are chaired by the Vice President, it's on all of our minds. And the truth is, for all the amazing history that the U.S. has with our own space program, we're really just getting our arms around what a world of widespread commercial space use actually amounts to.
Thank you. Let's take a student question from this side. I guess let's take the student right in front of the microphone in the interest of time.
Great.
Hi, Secretary Buttigieg. My name is Connor Thompson. I'm an undergraduate student at the Tepper School of Business here. And my question is on a major story in the news this week, JetBlue's blocked acquisition of Spirit Airlines. I know one of the major arguments is that it would have created a sort of a fifth major airline in the United States. What are your thoughts on that argument, and how do you think this decision spells for Alaskan Airlines takeover of Hawaiian that's supposed to go through later this year?
Yeah. So I think it was not well known that our department had responsibilities on competition policy alongside the DOJ. But we do. We just kind of slept on them for the last 30 or 40 years. And that's too bad, because the pattern in the U.S. aviation sector has been consolidation. I've been reading a history of airline deregulation as part of a new book by Ganesh Sitaraman, who's an old friend who's researched this very deeply. And he unearthed an interesting set of claims that were made at the time of deregulation in the 70s and 80s. One of which was that we would have up to 200 competitive airlines operating by the year 2000 efficiently in the US. Obviously, the tendency was very different. And if you're in business school, you understand some of the reasons why. Some of the very things that make this totally different than the market for peanut butter. The importance of scale, the importance of network effects, the rise of loyalty programs, which are a barrier to entry, in effect, or a way to create switching costs. And a number of other measures meant that this is not a normal textbook competitive market. And so the consolidation accelerated, and we're concerned about what that means. Does that mean you just keep consolidating until it's just Coke and Pepsi? Or maybe just Lufthansa? Like maybe you're down to one national? Is that where we're headed? I don't think that would be good for consumers. I'm already worried that the consolidation that's happened has not been good for consumers. A lot of research on the difference between having one or two competitive airlines and three or four on a given route and what that means. And so, the horse is out of the barn on deregulation, but that doesn't mean we just keep doing things the way we've always done them the last 30 or 40 years. And our decision to intervene in that case, to get involved and to publicly back the DOJ, was an expression of the importance of making sure that any proposed merger goes through a very rigorous test. Now, they're not stupid, right? Strategically, they knew that if we're really worried about competition, and that's why we're skeptical of a merger, the best argument they could make was to say, well, it's really going to be more competition, because even though we're taking two airlines and turning them into one airline, it's going to be another bigger airline against the other four. And that's part of what was adjudicated, and the court made a decision that was not convincing. So there are some nuances to this. And for that reason, I won't weigh in on the Alaska-Hawaii piece, just because that's up for active review right now. But what I will say is that I think that showed that, especially when being subjected to the kind of rigorous analysis that the court did, this was a problem in terms of the effect it was going to have on passengers and consumers. And we have to continue, I believe our department has to continue to develop some unused muscles of legal authority to be there for passengers, because if you ask most passengers, how they feel about their experiences as airline passengers, but people aren't happy. And you can blame the companies, but the companies are going to do whatever regulators let them, right? The companies are going to do whatever they can within the realm of the law. And if that means more profits with a terrible passenger experience, they almost have a fiduciary obligation to try to do it if we let them. If it meant less profits with a better passenger experience, they would have the opposite pressure not to do that. If they can make their money entirely off of credit cards, which if you've ever noticed how they make your flight attendant go through that entire monologue now when you're on the plane about the 50,000 points you're going to get, like they're already drifting in that direction. We clearly have some problems in the trajectory that industry has taken. And while, I'll just give you one, not to go on and on about this, but one way you can feel it is Pittsburgh, which is cleverly redesigning its airport that was built to be a hub for the US Air model, where 80% of your traffic was just passing through, and reconfigure it for the future where 90% of your traffic is actually origin or destination to Pittsburgh. Which meant rebuilding the whole thing, because when US Air got agglomerated into a bigger airline, that was part of a broader story in which Pittsburgh ceased to be a hub. This really affects communities and jobs as well as passengers. And that's why we're seeking to be a more aggressive watchdog on that issue.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, and that goes to Shubham Goel, who is a research assistant with Safety 21. I understand you have a question about a topic that is really on the Secretary's mind.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Shubham Goel. I serve as the president of Transportation Club at Carnegie Mellon and also the research assistant with Safety 21. I'm finally a grad student with the Heinz. I study public policy and data science. And before coming to US and Carnegie Mellon, I was working as a political consultant in India, wherein I designed a couple of state government programs with the state of West Bengal there. So my question for you is, like, how Department of Transportation is integrating AI technologies to enhance transportation system in the United States?
Yeah.
And what opportunities exist for academic clubs like us and students to kind of collaborate and contribute to this AI-driven initiative?
Great question. AI is, as you know, it's not just a hot topic nationally, but it's a major subject of consideration in our administration. President Biden's put out an executive order tasking all of us, including me, to work on this and to align our departments to do something about it. Here's how I'm thinking about it. I think the base and broadest level where it's going to matter is actually kind of unsexy, except if you're into the sort of thing, you see how interesting it could be, which is just how does AI change how quickly we can do the review of a grant agreement so that when we agreed to fund I-376, the money can actually move 9 months quicker than it would have because we automated some of the paper pushing, right? Or, getting emails written more efficiently, or legal briefs, or coding our own systems from the FAA if it can be done safely to an HR system. I know that doesn't sound as exciting as some of the other AI stuff, unless you're really into this, which I can tell folks here are. But I think it's important strategically, because what it means is we have to start thinking of AI, even in these early days, as a competency, not just a specialty. In other words, we don't have like a whole like side of the house at the U.S. Department of Transportation that deals with like the internet, right? I don't have an assistant secretary for the internet. All of us have to use the internet in different ways, right? A legislative affairs staffer uses the internet to research what the members of Congress are doing, and I use the internet to read the news clips, and there's a whole different set of applications if you're doing drone integration in the national airspace. It's just a thing you need to know how to do your job. And I think not just in our lifetimes, but in our very short kind of next few years, that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing. But there are also some things that are more AI specific. And a great example that I'm intrigued by that has some of the research of this institution in its DNA is applying AI to what it means to have complete streets. The concept of making our streets and roads and streetscapes more friendly and safe for everybody from pedestrians to small businesses to what used to be the only thing that mattered on streets, which is vehicles. And I think there could be some very interesting AI potential there. I think AI is especially helpful for dealing with problems at a scale that are just beyond what we can do, not just as a matter of brain power, but as a matter of numbers with humans. I'll give you one example. our extraordinary aviation system. The reason we have 16 million flights get to where they need to go safely is that a human being controls every one of those. And human pattern recognition over the airspace is part of why it's so hard and so important to become a qualified air traffic controller. The number of drones that are entering the airspace are so many that there aren't enough human beings in the world to train to handle those the same way we handle airliners. So AI's got to be some part of that picture. And then there's the really cosmic stuff. In fact, I can't resist doing some polls here just because you all think of it. It's like, how many of you would you describe yourselves as more optimistic, on the scale of optimistic versus anxious / frightened / terrified? Like, who's on team hopeful? Who's on like team optimism? Think like 20 years from now, we'll be better off than we are today because of AI. All right, that was about half. What about the other end? Who would kind of align mostly on the other end? Oh, interesting. All right, so the optimists actually have it here. That's interesting. Okay, good. Good. You all know a lot about this stuff, so I hope you're right. Because there's some really cosmic questions, right, about, and you've seen the timescales that some of these work. Like the way it's been explained to me as a layperson is that, if you believe this is about speed within certain levels of processing or quote unquote intelligence, then that's one thing. If, on the other hand, you believe that the progression is in what we might call the intelligence itself, it's actually analogous to human intelligence. And if it's actually true, and I know this is a suspect thing, but if it's actually true that there's a scale of intelligence from like an ant to the least intelligent human being to the most intelligent human being and so on, right? And if you believe that's fitted to the exponential growth that's theoretically possible with machine learning, then you could have a machine that at breakfast time is as intelligent as a chicken, and by dinner time has figured out the meaning of life, and can tell us all what to do, right? And might not bother to tell us what to do, but what if, I don't know, it's spooky, right? So I indulge in a little bit of that concern at the cosmic level, but I know that on a day-to-day level, the question of AI isn't about AI to me. It's about the things AI could help with. It's about safety, most of all, and I'll just keep coming back to it. We are living through a crisis that we haven't learned to think of as a crisis. It's about equity, if we get it right, and there's all kinds of ways AI can get it wrong and make it worse, but there's also ways that AI can make it better. Definitely climate, right? Because the climate challenge is a political challenge and it's a moral challenge, but it's very much a technical challenge. Or, to put it another way, the moral and political questions that we have proved morally and politically incapable of settling in a way that will keep warming below 1.5 degrees, for example, get a lot easier if you can solve certain technical questions that maybe we are up to solving with the help of AI. And also jobs, which I know are a concern here, and rightly so, but many at this institution have done really interesting work engaging labor unions and engaging workers on this. Whole new categories of jobs could open up. Famously, the ATM was thought to mean the end of employment in retail banking when it was invented. And instead, something else happened. It's true that fewer tellers were needed to get a cash out of a drawer and hand it to you. But it just meant that their jobs became more advanced. It was things that you really needed to have a customer stop in and talk to you about. Could that be the future? It should be, but that won't just happen. Those are the kinds of things we think about and worry about when we think about and worry about AI. And I can't wait to see what you all develop in places like this to help us meet those challenges, recognizing this tool, like any tool, is a means to an end. And the end is a life where we're all better off and safer and cleaner. It's greener and cleaner and fairer because we thought up all these great technologies and ideas.
That was very thoughtful, Secretary Buttigieg. We are out of time, but I cannot resist asking the next question, the final question. What excites you the most about the future?
I mean, this is a reductive thing to say, but what excites me most about the future is the idea that it can be better than the past or the present. And I know that it means something to say that, especially now. Like, we've got to talk about all the fun stuff and comparatively nonpartisan stuff and, stuff I get to work on. Like we all know, we could be having any number of other topics of discussion where a few hundred people could get together and be really frightened or really divided, or really troubled by what's going on in the world right now. That's not lost on me. It's been from the fact that we're a society recovering from a pandemic that killed 1 million of us, to the spectacle of the former leader of this country on criminal trial, which has an effect on you no matter what your politics are, to any of the other things we're grappling with as a country. Like, there's some rough stuff going on right now. But we also have some incredible stuff going on right now. And it's not just the administration accomplishments that it's very much my job to remind everybody of in terms of the job creation and the growth in personal income and the reductions we've seen in racial wealth gaps even, and all kinds of other things that are happening, manufacturing jobs coming back onto American soil, the big bridge the president was at yesterday announcing that it's getting done. But more broadly, the idea that if we can navigate this moment right, which is not a small thing to say that we might do, but if we do, when we do, and I think we will, it's going to be better. We are a generation, any generation alive now is a generation that has been forced to confront the fact that it's not automatic, which it used to be considered automatic, like the future is going to be better than the past. Of course it is, just economically. If you were born when my parents were born, you had a 90% chance of finishing off economically better than you started. If you were born the year I was born, you had a 50% chance, it's a coin flip, whether you're going to be better off or not. So that question, I know, this idea of the future, the sense of progress, it's contingent now, it's uncertain, it's not something we take for granted. But it's still there. It's still what could be. And whether it's the most kind of challenging political fight or the most arcane technical transportation thing that I get to touch, all of that's part of that. And the idea that by the time, and my eyes used to glaze over when politicians talk about their kids, but now I'm a dad and that's how I am too. Like, by the time my kids, who are now, they're twins, they're 2.5-year-old, by the time they're old enough to be like, hey, Papa, what were you doing in the 2020s? Like, when all this stuff was going on, like, what'd you do to make it better? That I could be like, yeah, we did. We got all this stuff right. And that's why, like, you know, you think about car crash deaths the way I think about, you know, dysentery as like something that doesn't really happen that much in our society anymore. And that's why, like, you're not worried about climate change the way we had to worry about climate change. And that's why, you know, you were in a democracy that's getting more democratic and not less. Like, we figured all this out on our watch, and we're handing it to you in better shape than we found it. I believe in that possibility. I work every day on that possibility. You all, whether it's in your civic activism and advocacy and involvement or in your research interests, are contributing to that. And that's what fills my sails.
So thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for your very insightful, constructive, thoughtful remarks here. We are overjoyed to have had you here. So let's thank the Secretary again. Thanks for coming.
Thanks again so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Anna. That was really good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.